welcome to the Windy Valley Digest. I'm Vince Cowley, and we're searching through the musty corners of bookshops, flea markets, libraries, and web archives to bring you stories that have been lost in time. This is episode 5, and today we'll be presenting part 3 of our 17-part series from Lawrence Clark's novel of the Secret Service, Bernard Treves' Boots. If you missed parts 1 and 2, visit our podcast page at www.windyvalleydigest.com/podcast to catch up on previous episodes. Before we begin today's episode, we invite you to step into the world of classic literature with the Windy Valley Bookshelf. Our YouTube channel brings timeless stories to life through immersive audio dramas and beautifully illustrated readings. Dive into Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, or Washington Irving's Old Christmas. Experience captivating storytelling and rediscover forgotten literary gems. If you're not already there, watch now at www.windyvalleybookshelf.com or find the link on the Windy Valley Digest website. Subscribe today and let the adventure begin. Before we dive into the chapters of Bernard Treves' Boots, let's take a moment to honor the voices of those who lived through the Great War. In every episode, we feature a letter from a World War I soldier. These letters offer a glimpse into the experiences of those who served, reminding us of the personal stories behind the headlines of history. Today, we share a letter from Antonio, an Italian prisoner of war. His words speak of hunger, hardship, and an aching longing for home. More than just a letter, it's a cry from the trenches, a prayer whispered through suffering. This is Antonio's story in his own words.
Oh, Mamma Mia, if you could see to what your son is reduced. They have sent me here to dig trenches on the shore of the sea, and when we can do no more, they beat us, and the other day 2 of our number died. Oh, my mother, I pray you on my knees, go every day to the church and pray for your son to the Blessed Virgin of the Rosary, and to our great protector, St. Anthony, because they alone possess the grace to save thy poor son, who is dying of hunger and weakness, for one works 15 hours a day, and they give us to eat 3 boiled potatoes, and then many beatings. The other day a fisherman gave me 2 fishes, and I ate them raw, which at one time would have filled me with disgust, but when there is hunger, everything is good. Yesterday I was thinking so much of my dear country and of my mother that many tears fell from my eyes, and the sergeant of the guard gave me a kick and wished to throw me into the sea. Oh, Mamma Mia, when the weather is fine, I see far, far away across the sea a strip of land which they have told me is Italy, and I wish to throw myself into the sea and swim to return to my dear country. But the sea is so deep, deep, and I do not know how to swim, and I can do nothing but weep when I see how many of my companions are dying. Oh, dear mother, I wish that I could close my eyes for always, so that I could not see any more of this wretchedness. But I think of thee, and of my dear country, and of the hearth where we sat to tell stories, and I think of Angiolina, whom I love so well, and whom I have promised to marry. And now I pray so much to the Blessed Virgin of the Rosary, and to our Lord Jesus, who has had thorns on his head, and has suffered so greatly, that he will give me strength to support this anguish. And also thou, my mother, pray for thy dear son, that he may not close his eyes in this inferno, and that he may return home safe and sound. Keep well, my mother, and receive many kisses and embraces from thy unhappy prisoner son. Farewell, farewell, thy son Antonio.
Antonio passed his letter to a fisherman, a stranger moved by his suffering, in hopes that it might reach his mother. He didn't know if it would. In a quiet postscript, he asked for prayers, sent kisses to his beloved Angiolina, and held on to a fragile hope that they might one day see each other again. The letter is dated June 1916. After that, we have no further record of Antonio. His fate remains a mystery, but through his words we remember him, not as a forgotten prisoner of war, but as a son, a fiancé, a soul reaching out across the sea. Antonio's letter offers a real and heartbreaking glimpse into the human cost of war. A voice nearly lost to history, it reminds us that behind every conflict are individual lives marked by suffering, hope, and resilience. While Antonio's story is rooted in fact, our next narrative takes us into the realm of fiction, a tale woven with deception, danger, and the complexities of identity during wartime. In our previous episodes, we were introduced to Captain Gilbert, who, while recruiting soldiers, recognized John Manton as a look-alike for Bernard Treves and suspected him of using a false identity. Manton, of course, insisted on his own innocence, explaining that he was wrongly blamed for missing money. Captain Gilbert believed him and devised a plan. Manton then visited Treves, who was quite startled by their resemblance. Treves offered Manton £150 to assume his identity and then mysteriously disappeared. Uncertain of Treves' motives, Manton took on his name and lodgings. Soon after, he received a letter from Treves' father, Colonel Treves, who believed Manton was his son and demanded a visit. At Heatherfield Grange, Colonel Treves confronted Manton about his supposed disgrace and insisted he redeem himself. Moved by the colonel's disappointment, Manton promised to rejoin the army. Manton returned to Captain Gilbert, who revealed that Bernard Treves was in a nursing home due to severe neurasthenia. He asked Manton to continue the impersonation for Treves' protection. While examining some of Treves' letters, they discovered correspondence from a doctor offering a cure for drug addiction and another from a mysterious G. Manners requesting an urgent meeting. Heading to St. George's Square for the meeting, Manton arrived early to observe the area. He saw a well-dressed, military-age man enter number 208, the meeting location. Inside, this man, identified as a German baron, confronted Gottfried Manwitz, alias Godfrey Manners, about his intelligence failures regarding a British military expedition. They discussed a former British officer disgraced and addicted to drugs whom Manwitz had been manipulating. The Baron believed this officer may be useful for their plans, and Manwitz presented a letter confirming the intelligence about a ship's departure, signed by the officer as proof of his control over him. So, what kind of trouble was Bernard Treves involved in, and how does it connect to Manton's impersonation? How does Treves' identity fit into the Baron and Manners' plans? As Manton navigates this web of deception, will his impersonation put him in danger? Join us for today's episode as we uncover the twists and turns of this captivating narrative.
"Do I introduce you as Captain Cherriton, Herr Baron?" asked Manwitz, when Conrad had closed the door and departed. "Yes," said the Baron. "I find the name of the poor dead Captain Cherriton an excellent recommendation in even the best of homes." He smiled his somewhat derisive smile. A moment later the door opened and John Manton stepped into the room. Manners rose and held out his hand. "My dear Treves," he said, "you have been away from me a very long time." He was thinking to himself that Treves carried himself a little better than usual. His gaze was more direct, his hand gripped firmer. However, there was no suspicion in his eyes as he turned towards the younger man at the hearth. "Captain Cherriton," he said, "this is a young friend of mine, Mr. Treves." For a moment Rathenau's light blue eyes widened and then narrowed. "We've met before, Mr. Treves?" "In the square half an hour ago. I saw you come in." "Oh, yes, yes," returned the Baron. "My good friend Mr. Manners has been telling me about you." "I hope he had something complimentary to say," smiled John Manton. He was thinking to himself, There is no doubt at all in my mind that this big fat man, Mr. Manners, is a German. His finger-nails are cut neatly to a point. John recalled the habit of the Germans he had met at Feldkirch, of the masters of his school who had trimmed their nails in that particular fashion. Rather a Chinese fashion, John thought. His eyes travelled from the fat man's face and took in the younger man's hard countenance. He was recalling something he had read of Captain Cherriton. "I think I remember reading something about you, Captain Cherriton," he ventured. "You mean my escape from the British officers' prison camp at Celle?" replied the German easily. "Yes," returned John, "that was it. You had rather an adventurous time getting across the frontier." "I had a pretty hot time," laughed Cherriton. The conversation between the three became general after this, and presently Cherriton invited John to accompany him to his hotel in the Strand. "Come along and have a drink and smoke with me. I should much like to have a chat with you, Treves." John considered the proposal for a moment, and then decided to go. He bade good night to Manners, and as he shook hands with the big man, a little file of white tabloids passed from Manners' palm to his own. For a minute John felt inclined to ask a question, but caution saved him. He slipped the little cocaine tablets into his waistcoat pocket, thanked Manners under his breath, and followed Cherriton, who had taken up his light overcoat and was moving towards the door. It was quite dark in the square when they emerged, and in the distance, near the river, a taxi was moving slowly. "That is my vehicle," remarked Cherriton, standing under the light of a shaded lamp, so that the distant taxi man could observe him. A minute later the taxi drew to a halt. John stepped inside and Cherriton followed him. As the taxi door closed, a man, who had been standing in the darkness against the rails of the square opposite, stepped out into the road and signalled with his arm. At that moment John was leaning back in the taxi, giving himself up to thoughts of the swift events of the last half hour. Who was this Captain Cherriton, who appeared to have taken such a fancy to him? Was it possible? His thoughts received a jolt. "Hey, stop!" a loud voice from the road echoed in his ears. John was projected forward almost upon his face. The vehicle came to a sudden halt. The door of the taxi was flung open. Two men appeared in the aperture, and a heavy hand fell upon John's shoulder. He glanced at his companion and saw that, from the other side, intruders were also laying heavy hands upon him. With a mighty wrench of his shoulder, John snatched himself free. Scarcely knowing what had happened, he attempted to dash after his companion, who had been dragged out into the road. He was ignominiously pulled back by the leg. He heard a voice shouting, "Don't bother about the other one. This is our man." Then, in a confusion of gripping hands, John was flung back on the seat of the taxi. A voice spoke firmly in his ear. "You'll keep quiet, young man, or it will be the worse for you." John saw Captain Cherriton flitting like a shadow along the road and out of the square. He looked at the person who was seated beside him in the taxi, and was surprised to find a big typical police officer in plain clothes. Opposite John, two other officers, who had crowded into the vehicle, were seated, looking at him with steady, interested gaze. "Your name's Treves?" demanded one of the men. "What of it?" returned John. "It's all I want to know," answered the man coldly. As the taxi glided along, John strove to gather his scattered wits, but it was not until a plain, quietly furnished room had been achieved in Scotland Yard that any light broke in upon his senses. He found himself confronted by a tall, grey moustached man in civilian clothes. The man was standing beside a table, and beside him stood a distinguished-looking staff officer. As John entered the room in charge of two detectives, his senses were still in a whirl from the swiftness of his adventure. The grey moustached man, whom the detectives addressed as Sir Robert, rose from his chair and looked at him with stern, brooding eyes. Then his gaze turned to one of John's captors, who had entered the room and was holding Baron Rathenau's overcoat on his arm. "Have you his papers?" he demanded. "That is not my overcoat," intervened John. "Silence!" commanded Sir Robert. The detective went through the pockets of the overcoat. He found a small time table, 2 or 3 paid restaurant bills, and finally the letter Treves had written to Manners. The grey moustached police commissioner took these articles and laid them on the blotting pad before him. Then, at a brief command, a second detective stepped forward and searched John's pockets, taking out the 2 letters that had been addressed to Treves, and the telegram signed Elaine. These also were laid upon the desk. The staff officer and Sir Robert read them carefully. When the officer, whom John observed to be a general of staff, read Treves' incriminating letter to Manners, he drew in his breath and whistled. "My God!" he exclaimed. The grey moustached man took the letter from his fingers, read it, then held it forth towards John. His tone was utterly aloof, cold, and forbidding. "It was unfortunate, Treves," he said, "that you should carry this letter in your pocket. For this, added to the information we have gathered about you during the past 3 months, condemn you absolutely." He paused a moment, then went on. "I can only say," he added ruthlessly, "that I thank God we have been able to lay our hands on you." It was only in that moment that John for the first time realised the appalling danger that was sweeping upon him. "I would like to make some explanation, sir." "Your correspondence," retorted Sir Robert, with sinister meaning, "has made all the explanation we require. General Whiston here is quite satisfied, and so am I." General Whiston, who had been looking fixedly at John, now passed round the table and walked towards him. He was a tall, bronzed man, with a clipped moustache and a wide, strong mouth. John had recognised his name in a moment. He was Colonel Treves' old friend. "Bernard Treves," said General Whiston, "you have broken your father's heart already. You must now make your peace with God. There is only one thing left for me to do for my old and dear friend, and I intend to do it. He shall never learn that his son died as a traitor to his country. Even now," he went on, "though I have had you watched for 3 months, I can still scarcely credit it. You, a Treves!" He glanced towards the door. John felt a heavy hand fall upon his shoulder from behind. "This way, please," said a polite voice in his ear. As the detective's voice sounded in his ear, and the detective's hand fell on his shoulder, John's scurrying senses seemed to gather themselves together. He became calm in presence of the greatest danger his life had ever known. When next he spoke, his voice was steady, and his manner, despite its deep gravity, portrayed not the slightest trace of nervousness. "Sir," he said, "may I speak merely 1 or 2 words before I am removed?" He looked into the bronzed countenance of Colonel Treves' old friend. There was no pity for him on that strong, handsome face. In General Whiston's eyes he had been guilty of the blackest of all crimes. The General answered in his deep-toned voice of authority. "You will be permitted to make a statement, but not now." "I have a very important declaration to make, sir." Sir Robert, who was still scrutinising the incriminating letter that had been taken from Rathenau's overcoat, looked up now, then rapidly pencilled a few words on a slip of paper, which he handed to Whiston. The General read the slip. "Yes, perhaps so," he said. "I agree with you. Time is everything." Sir Robert looked into John's face. "Are you prepared," he went on, "to give us the name of the person to whom this letter was written?" He lifted Treves' incriminating missive and held it for John's inspection. John had already been permitted to read the letter, though not to hold it in his hand. "Certainly," answered Manton. A slight flicker of surprise lit in Sir Robert's eyes. "His name," answered John, "is either Manners or Cherriton." Sir Robert laid down the letter with an impatient gesture. "That is no answer to my question. You wrote the letter yourself. To whom did you write it?" "I didn't write it." "You suggest that it is a forgery?" "Either you wrote the letter or you didn't write it," pursued Sir Robert. "Your statements contradict each other. You say in the first place that you did not write it. In the second place you say that it is not a forgery." General Whiston now spoke, his stern gaze on John's face. "This letter," he said, glancing towards the sheet, "is in your own writing, which I happen to know very well. Your attempt at mystification," he went on, "will be of no avail, either now or later." John felt in his tones intense antagonism. "If I might be permitted to speak to you gentlemen alone," he said, "I will in 3 minutes explain the mystery." General Whiston glanced at the Commissioner of Police. "It is for you to say, Sir Robert," he said. "To night the affair is in your hands." Sir Robert pondered the subject for a moment, then glanced at the detectives who stood behind John. With his hand he made a slow, significant gesture. John, who was standing at attention before the table, heard the detectives move away, and a moment later the door softly closed behind them. He was alone with the Commissioner of Police and the General. On his accusers' faces John read a stern and determined intention that the law should take its course, not the tortuous, long-drawn old law of pre-war days, but the swift justice which is meted out to traitors. "You shall have 3 minutes in which to speak." Sir Robert's voice smote John's ears. Manton knew that if he held his peace and the law moved with its inexorable swiftness, he would by to morrow have expiated the crime of another man. He was in another man's shoes. Innocently he had taken up that other man's identity. But he had not shouldered everything. He had not rendered himself liable for that other man's treachery. And yet, at the back of his mind there was pity even for Treves. He thought of the man's weakness, of his shattered nerves, of Manners's obvious power over him. Perhaps even in uttering the truth to these two stern judges he might put in a good word for Treves. "The statement I have to make, gentlemen, is an amazing one." "It will also have to be a brief one," retorted Sir Robert coldly. "Well, out with it!" interposed General Whiston. John turned towards him. "I wish to say, sir, that I am not Bernard Treves." A flash of anger lit in General Whiston's eyes. "You say that, despite the fact that I am prepared to identify you as Bernard Treves?" "My statement," returned John, "is, I admit, an amazing one. Nevertheless, it is a fact, gentlemen. My name is Manton." The Commissioner of Police pulled at his moustache. "A statement of this kind," he said, "is ridiculous in presence of General Whiston, who knows you and recognises your handwriting in this letter." He leaned back in his chair and struck the letters that had been taken from John's pocket with the back of his hand. "These letters, taken from your person, this telegram addressed to you, and this letter conveying information to the enemy, are sufficient in themselves to identify you." "There is nothing you wish to say, General?" asked Sir Robert of Whiston. The General shook his head, and Sir Robert put his thumb on the bell push at the corner of his desk. John heard the whir of a bell in the room beyond. "I am prepared, sir," he said hurriedly, "to prove every word I say. My name is Manton, and I undertook to assume Treves's identity merely to please a friend who wished to help him." "You are ready to give us the name of your friend, of course," interposed General Whiston. He had been utterly unmoved by this statement of John's. "His name is Gilbert, sir. Captain Gilbert of Ryde, Isle of Wight." General Whiston answered nothing. There was no softening in the harshness of his expression. For a moment he was silent. Then, with a glance at Sir Robert, he moved towards the door. "Just a few minutes, Sir Robert," he said. "This is a matter easy of proof." He passed out of the room. At the door, as he drew it open, John heard him speaking to two men outside. "Sir Robert will be ready for you in 5 minutes," he was saying. The door closed. Sir Robert tapped his fingers upon the surface of his desk. "You wish to affirm that Captain Gilbert is prepared to prove the truth of your statement?" "I am sure he will be prepared to prove that my name is Manton," answered John. In his long experience Sir Robert had come across many singular and dramatic events. The great police force of which he was the chief was dealing always in drama. In his experience he had interviewed every quality and degree of criminal, from affluent company promoters downward. John's bearing and manner struck him as nothing unusual. John's statement that his was a case of mistaken identity, that Scotland Yard for once made a mistake, meant nothing to the police commissioner. Such a statement was one of the commonest in his experience. He felt no sympathy for John, and, believing explicitly in his guilt, was determined to listen no further. He leaned forward and began to make rapid notes upon the writing-pad. Manton, in the meantime, stood motionless beyond the desk. Save for the movement of Sir Robert's pen and the tick of a small travelling clock on Sir Robert's desk, no sound disturbed the heavy silence. Despite his calmness, John felt the tension grow upon him. The waiting seemed to draw itself out. He glanced at the clock and observed that it was only a little after 10. The whirl of events that night sped through his mind in rapid panorama, but of one thing he was certain. Manners and Captain Cherriton were either spies or traitors, and Scotland Yard, in laying hands upon him and allowing Cherriton to go, had made a mistake. He had already guessed that General Whiston had gone to telephone Captain Gilbert. He recalled now the letter General Whiston had written to old Colonel Treves, the letter which said that he had done for Bernard Treves everything that was possible. His mind then turned again to Gilbert. He wondered what the captain would do when he heard of the extraordinary outcome of his visit to St. George's Square. He had gone there at Gilbert's own suggestion. He felt that the situation for himself at that moment was delicate in the extreme. But it was not yet fatal. A miscarriage of justice was impossible if Gilbert spoke up, as no doubt he would do. He knew that all Gilbert's sympathy for Bernard Treves would vanish the moment he heard to what depths that young man had descended. He recalled what Gilbert had said. "Treves is afraid. He imagines that some one is watching him." Then it suddenly occurred to John that at the back of Treves' mind there had been a subtle idea against himself. Treves had desired that he, John, should step into his guilty shoes, and should not only wear those shoes, but should suffer for his crime. "I stepped into far deeper water than I knew," mused John, and as the thought passed through his mind, the door opened and General Whiston re-entered. The General walked behind John, then turned and looked keenly into his face. "Treves," he said, "you will be examined again in the morning." Sir Robert's finger was suspended over the bell upon his desk. In answer to his inquiring glance, General Whiston nodded. Again John felt a man's hand laid on his shoulder, and for the second time a voice uttering polite words, "This way, please." This time, however, there was no pause. He was led out into the corridor, with a tall, heavily built man at his side, and another walking behind him. The door of Sir Robert's room closed with a soft click.
You're listening to the Windy Valley Digest podcast, but the stories don't stop here. At the Windy Valley Digest, we are more than just a podcast. We are curating a growing collection of stories, original works, lost classics, fables, poetry, and timeless tales that speak to the heart and the choices we all face. From The Last Beacon to The Ugly Duckling, from ancient morals to modern dilemmas, it's all part of our mission to bring lost stories to light. So, when today's episode ends, Visit the Windy Valley Digest at www.windyvalleydigest.com or follow the link in the video description or show notes and see what's waiting to be rediscovered. And now, back to our story.
The moment the door closed upon John, General Whiston flung himself into a chair beside Sir Robert's table. There was an expression on his face that puzzled the Police Commissioner. "Well, Sir Robert," began the General, "it is an amazing thing, but Captain Gilbert corroborates our prisoner's statement entirely." Sir Robert flashed a glance at the incriminating letters on the table. "That's impossible." "Nevertheless, Gilbert, who is a very sound officer, corroborates every word this young man has said. I have ordered Gilbert to present himself here first thing in the morning." Sir Robert was staring in utter bewilderment. "You mean we have got the wrong man?" "I don't know," answered the General impatiently. "The thing is beyond my capacity. I've known this young blackguard for years. Only slightly, of course, but I would have sworn to him anywhere. Gilbert, however, tells me an extraordinary story. He says our prisoner is a thoroughly honest fellow by the name of Manton. He gave me a minute history of the man, who was formerly at Scarthoe Head. I have ordered the adjutant from Scarthoe to report himself here to morrow. We can then get to the bottom of this extraordinary tangle." "But," protested Sir Robert, "these letters must be explained, and you have had this man watched for months." "Precisely. That complicates matters enormously." "Was Treves guilty of the crimes laid against him, or was this man guilty?" inquired Sir Robert. The General shook his head in bewilderment. "Don't ask me. I don't know," he said. "To morrow will settle everything." The night that followed was the longest that John had ever spent. What if by some awful mischance Captain Gilbert disowned him entirely? However, he could not think that of Gilbert. He was prepared to swear by the captain's honesty. A police officer called him early next morning. He dressed and was served with a satisfactory breakfast. A morning newspaper was brought to him, but at 10 o'clock he was peremptorily summoned to present himself in Sir Robert's room. Under escort he made his way along various passages. The door was opened, and he stepped into the room and stood at attention. Sir Robert was not present. General Whiston stood at the window, and near him was a sleek-looking, smooth-haired, clean-shaven man in a morning coat, well-cut trousers, and patent leather boots. John could feel the stranger's eyes steadily upon him. Then Whiston turned from the window. "Captain Gilbert," he said, "has been here. He has made certain statements on your behalf which are so far satisfactory." A silence fell. The stranger moved to Sir Robert's desk, seated himself in Sir Robert's chair, and beckoned John to a chair opposite. Dacent Smith was the head of a great branch of the Secret Intelligence Department, but there was no air of authority in his manner. "Sit down, please," he said. His voice was smooth and agreeable. He glanced at the window, then again at John. "Will you kindly tell me the name of your officer in command at Scarthoe Fort?" John promptly gave him the name. "How many men were in the fort?" The quiet gentleman, who possessed one of the subtlest brains in England, glanced at a slip of paper on his desk. He was putting John through an examination such as many a suspected person had failed to survive. 150, sir. 80 at the lower fort, and 70 at the upper, exclusive of officers." "Can you recollect the calibre of the guns?" John gave the exact dimensions of the guns at both the lower and upper fort. "Can you possibly recollect," inquired the other, "from your books, what store of 6-inch ammunition there was?" Fortunately, John recollected the number of shells exactly. "I see," commented the cross-examiner. "But your statement doesn't tally with my present knowledge." "I am speaking of 6 weeks ago, sir. Since then there would have been a heavy gun practice," John added promptly. The elder gentleman leaned back in his chair. These are all details which a spy would make a great point of observing." He looked steadily into John's face until John became conscious of nothing but his keen grey eyes. They were kindly eyes, but the intensity of his glance was something that John had never before experienced. He looked back frankly into the elder man's face. "I suppose they are, sir," he answered. "But they came to me in my ordinary course of work." "How many fort candles were there in the store room?" asked the other casually. "8 dozen, sir." Dacent Smith nodded as though satisfied. "We will now come to another matter," he said. "You were educated in Germany?" John admitted the fact. "Have you been in Germany since your boyhood?" "Never, sir." "What is your opinion of Captain Gilbert?" "I took a great liking to him." "You trusted him when he asked you to assume another man's identity?" "Absolutely, sir." "So do I," said Dacent Smith, suddenly changing his tone. "I trust him absolutely. I will only try your patience just one moment longer." He pushed a clean slip of paper towards John. "Would you mind writing on that these 3 words: 'Deceive,' 'parallel,' and 'nursery'? Just scribble them quickly, without care." John wrote the words and handed them across the table. The elder man took the sheet and immediately compared it with Treves's incriminating letter and a pile of other letters in Treves's handwriting which lay beside him. He glanced up at the General, who stood near the window. "The handwriting is totally unlike, General. Moreover, our young friend here can spell the words, whereas from letters supplied us by Gilbert, Treves could not." He turned again and looked at John. Then he broke into a smile that John found charming. "Well, Manton," he said, "you have come through the ordeal excellently. But as a matter of formality you must be identified both by Captain Gilbert and your adjutant from Scarthoe Head." "Thank you, sir," answered John. "I am sorry to have caused so much trouble." "No, not at all," protested the elder man. "Your desire for adventure placed you in a very nasty position. But such trouble as you have caused us may yet be turned to good account." John hesitated a moment, then ventured: "If I may, sir, I would like to make a statement in regard to the man Manners at 208 St. George's Square. I am certain he is a spy, sir, a German spy." "My dear Manton," said Dacent Smith, laying his hands on the desk, "we know that already." "And the other man," continued John, "Cherriton. I don't believe he is all he pretends to be." At the mention of Cherriton the lightness of mood vanished from the elder man. "What name?" he inquired. "Captain Cherriton, the man with the fair hair, who was in the taxi with me. The police officers allowed him to escape." Beyond the table the great man of the Secret Service, who had been cross-examining him, eased his spectacles. For without knowing it, John had made a statement which aroused all his interest. "This afternoon, Manton," he said, "you must come to my room. It seems to me," he continued, "you can be of very great use to my department." "What is your department, sir?" asked John politely. The elder man smiled. "I think we need not give it a name, Manton. But perhaps you can guess. Perhaps, indeed, you are destined to make further acquaintance with my department and with your friend, Mr. Manners." He paused a moment. "Captain Gilbert tells me that you wish to rejoin the army." "That is so, sir," answered John. "An excellent intention," continued Dacent Smith. "But it has occurred to me that there is other work of national importance which may suit you better." He glanced at Whiston. "With General Whiston's aid I think we can arrange that you do not appear in uniform for some time. Another thing Captain Gilbert reported to me," he went on quietly, "is that you are a young man with a taste for adventure." John smiled. Dacent Smith extended his hand in farewell. "You are a free man, Manton. But I shall expect you to come to my rooms at 286 Jermyn Street at 3 o'clock this afternoon." He gave John a card. "You will give this to my servant at the door." The card read: Mr. Dacent Smith, Savile Club. That and nothing more. At the time when John was undergoing his cross-examination at the hands of the great Dacent Smith, Manners and Captain Cherriton were seated in a back room at a house in Hampstead. Cherriton, who had read half a dozen morning papers, glanced at his companion. "There is no word in any of them about our friend Treves." "There was scarcely time for an announcement," Manners answered. "Perhaps it will be in the evening papers." The two men waited till evening, but still the papers contained no line about Treves's capture. Cherriton was still not sure on what charge Treves had been arrested. If the charge had been an ordinary one, other than treason, there would already have been an account of some kind. "We must find out some other way than through the papers." "I have an excellent way of finding out," observed Manners. "Well, put it into execution at once," returned his superior. Manners looked at his watch. "That way won't do until after 6 o'clock. After 6 o'clock, Herr Baron, I will take you into the presence of the most beautiful girl in England." "I do not admire English beauty," answered Rathenau caustically. Manners lifted his hands. "Ah, but this one, she is wonderful." "How will she know about Treves any more than we do?" Manners looked across at him. "Leave that to me," he said. "I can assure you she will know." He took out his pocket book and looked up an address. "If we go now," he said, "we shall get there a little after 6, in time to interview the lady on her return from business." Half an hour later a taxi sped along Kentish Town Road and turned into Bowles Avenue, Camden Town. The street was a particularly respectable one, with windows and doors freshly painted. Judging from the cleanliness of the curtains and the brightness of the door handles, the inhabitants of this thoroughfare each took a pride in his residence. The taxi containing Manners and Cherriton drew to a halt before the door of number 65. Cherriton paid the driver and dismissed him. The two men crossed the pavement, and Manners lifted the bright brass knocker. 3 times Manners knocked. He was that day attired with particular smartness in a grey soft felt hat, a grey frock coat, and light fawn linen gaiters. The Baron was wearing a navy blue suit made for him at the Army and Navy Stores. He also wore a grey felt hat, set well back on his head. In his hip pocket he carried a Mauser pistol, but this was always part of his apparel, as it were. Manners carried other little aids to his personal safety, but upon that evening their mission was pacific. They had only a desire to ask a certain lady if she had news of Treves. 3 times Manners applied the knocker. Then footsteps came rapidly along the passage. The door was opened by a tall, brown-haired girl, wearing a white blouse and blue skirt, both of which Cherriton noticed were well cut. The girl's complexion was not pale, yet tended towards pallor. Her cheeks were softly rounded, her chin small, yet firm. Her eyes were grey, frank and steady in gaze. Cherriton, noticing her long curved lashes and finely arched brows, conceded that here, for once, he was looking upon a truly beautiful Englishwoman. "Good evening," Manners was saying. He had lifted his hat with extreme politeness. "Good evening," responded the girl, looking with puzzled eyes from one man to the other. "You have no doubt forgotten me," Manners spoke again, and then a faint recognition came to the girl's eyes. "Oh, not at all," she said. "Will you come in?" She led the way to a little parlour, a bright little apartment where she lived alone. She had made it as pretty and comfortable as possible with her small means. The two Germans entered the room, and Manners closed the door. After some preliminary conversation he broached the subject of his visit, but artfully and cunningly hiding it in a veil of words. "I have some business, madam," he said, "with"—he paused a moment—"with Mr. Treves. I have lost his address. I wonder if you could give it me." The girl looked at him a moment. An expression of reserve came into her face. "I am afraid I cannot oblige you," she said. "You have heard from him lately?" The girl hesitated a moment, and pushed back the fine brown hair from her brow. "Not lately," she answered. "You will be seeing him again shortly, no doubt?" pursued Manners, smiling amicably. "I don't know," said the girl. "I am afraid," she said, "I cannot give you his address, and if that is all you wish to see me about——" She rose quite politely but firmly, and as she did so some one lifted the knocker of the front door and smote it thrice. Manners started visibly. "You have visitors?" he asked quickly. "I don't know who it can be," said the girl. "I am expecting no one." Manners sprang up and stood between her and the door. He looked into her face as she came towards him, then moved politely away. He felt that her candid eyes held no secrets. When the door had closed he turned to Cherriton. "She has heard nothing of him. She knows no more than we do." "She is a beautiful woman, I'll admit," said Cherriton, who had been deep in thought. He raised his strong, supple hand and pointed towards the door. "Just open that," he said quietly, "and see who it is who is coming to visit her." Manners, with his usual swiftness of step and dexterity of movement, approached the door and noiselessly drew it open. Quietly he put his head out and looked along the passage. Then he drew back and gently closed the door. His face, when he turned towards Cherriton, was deathly white. "Who is it?" demanded Cherriton, who had come swiftly to his feet. "Bernard Treves," answered Manners, moistening his lips with his tongue. The thought that Treves had betrayed them blazed through his mind. In an instant Cherriton sprang to the window and peered furtively up and down the street. "He's alone," he said, with a note of relief in his voice. "Gott in Himmel!" exclaimed Manners under his breath. "How did he get here?" "Either escaped or acquitted," answered Cherriton curtly. "Our business," he went on swiftly under his breath, "is to express great delight when we see him. In the meantime I'll compose myself with a cigarette." "I don't know why his coming back like this should make me feel so nervous," mused Manners. "I am more psychic than you are, Herr Baron." Cherriton looked at the big, fat figure in the chair opposite him. He curled his lip in faint contempt. Meanwhile, John Manton, having knocked at the door of 65 Bowles Avenue, found to his astonishment that that door was opened by a girl of most extreme beauty. He had come there under orders from Dacent Smith to discover the identity of the sender of the telegram signed Elaine. He had been given many instructions during that afternoon, but as he stood upon the threshold of No. 65 a swift admiration leapt into his eyes for the girl who confronted him on the doorstep. "May I come in?" asked John. "Of course," answered the girl. To his amazement she seized his hand as she spoke. "Oh, how long you have been!" she said. She drew him into the hall and closed the door. Silence and caution were the parts John had been ordered to play. He did not withdraw his hand from her warm grasp. "You never came, you never wrote," continued the girl. "I wasn't able to," John answered truthfully. "And yet I told you, Bernard," she went on, looking up into his face—he was glad that the light in the hall was not intense—"and yet I told you, Bernard, that if you confessed everything to your father he would forgive." "He has forgiven a great deal," answered Manton vaguely. He looked down at her. A little colour had come into her cheeks, and as for her eyes, he had never seen eyes which evoked in him so much admiration. At that moment Manners put his face out at the door of the inner room, then swiftly withdrew it. "Who's that?" John asked quickly. "It's a man who has come to see you, Bernard. But before you go in I want to say—" she laid her hand softly on the lapel of John's coat—"I want to say, Bernard, that I forgive you—everything." She was smiling at him. a smile of wonderful beauty. "After all, Bernard," she whispered, "I am your wife, and it is a wife's privilege to forgive." "Yes," answered John. He could think of nothing else to say. Here was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, holding his hand warmly in hers, and telling him she forgave him everything. The situation would have been delightful if he had only been the other man. "Bernard, for my sake, you will try, won't you?" She paused, and this time he was obliged to frame some sort of answer. "I'll do the best I can," he said lamely, then added, to turn the subject, "Who is your visitor?" "It's Mr. Manners, the big stout man you brought here a long while ago. He has a friend with him, a younger man." "Captain Cherriton?" asked John, lowering his voice. The girl nodded. "They came to ask where you were, and wanted your address, but I remembered what you told me and would not give it." Then for the first time John looked keenly into her face. He had never seen her in his life before, and at any moment she might recognise him. But even with that danger hovering over him he could not help wondering if she loved Treves. "Come, Bernard," she took his hand in hers, "you must see your friends and get rid of them." John walked with her along the narrow passage. At the door of the parlour the girl halted. "When they are gone," she whispered, "I have whole heaps of things to tell you." She pushed open the door and followed John into the room. Manners, who was seated at the hearth, sprang up and rushed towards Manton. "Come in!" he cried, drawing John forward. "It does my eyes good to see you again, Captain Cherriton?" Baron Rathenau, who had also risen, enclosed Manton's fingers in his hard, cold grip. "I, too, am glad to see you," he said, fixing his eyes steadily on John's.
That brings us to the close of this episode of the Windy Valley Digest podcast. In today's podcast, we witnessed two very different but equally haunting struggles. The real-world suffering of Antonio, a young man clinging to hope amidst the inhumanity of war, and the shadowy world of John Manton, caught in a web of lies, loyalties, and espionage he never asked to enter. One factual and one fictional, both lives raise the same unsettling questions. What do we become when the world around us falls apart? And how far would we go to survive, or to protect the truth? Both were brought to life in this episode by the voice of David Wales. If today's story moved you, challenged you, or simply left you wanting more, I encourage you to visit the Windy Valley Digest at www.windyvalleydigest.com. There, you'll find the full archive of stories, from fables to poetry to long-form fiction, and new pieces posted regularly. At the Windy Valley Digest, we're committed to bringing lost stories to light, because sometimes it's the forgotten voices that speak the loudest. As we close, I leave you with this thought from Winston Churchill. In wartime, truth is so precious, she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. For the Windy Valley Digest, this is Vince Cowley. Stay curious and keep reading.